The banker who lent his wife to 7 factory owners, the deal that ruined an inheritance in Chicago, 1893. In 1893, in the heart of Chicago's industrial district, banker Theodore Whitmore made the unthinkable. He created an arrangement allowing 7 factory owners to pursue intimate relations with his own wife, Catherine. What began as a desperate attempt to secure his banking empire ended by destroying one of the most prominent families in the Midwest. You're watching stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about history. If this content impacts you, leave your like to support our work. We spend countless hours researching to bring you these narratives. Share this with anyone who needs to understand this chapter of American history. Leave your comment saying where you're watching from. We want to know if our audience spans the globe. And tell us what you would do if you discovered a family secret as disturbing as this one. The year was 1893. America was experiencing the Gilded Age's final years, but in Chicago's industrial core, the system of power and exploitation functioned with brutal efficiency. The Whitmore Banking House, located on LaSalle Street, was one of the city's most influential financial institutions. Its marble halls processed millions in industrial loans and its vaults held the fortunes of Chicago's elite. Theodore Whitmore, at 48 years old, was respected throughout the financial community. Descendant of New England bankers, he had built his fortune through 3 generations of strategic lending and industrial investment. His institution financed steel mills, railroad expansion, and manufacturing operations across the Midwest. Catherine Elizabeth Whitmore, his wife of 12 years, was considered one of Chicago's most refined women. At 32, she maintained the elegance and composure expected of a banking magnate's spouse. Educated at a prestigious Boston finishing school, she spoke fluent French and played piano with remarkable skill. The marriage had been arranged in 1881, uniting 2 established financial families. For 12 years, they had tried to have children. Catherine had conceived 3 times, but lost each pregnancy in the early months. The physicians of the era couldn't explain the successive losses, attributing them to her delicate constitution. For Theodore, the absence of heirs represented more than personal tragedy, it meant the end of a dynasty. Without children, his vast fortune would be contested by distant relatives after his death. The social pressure was immense. In patriarchal society of the 1890s, a man without descendants was considered incomplete. Everything changed in November 1892 when Theodore received a letter from his business associate in Boston, describing unorthodox practices that had resulted in heirs for other banking families. What was written in that letter would plant the seed of the most controversial decision of his life. The letter arrived on a cold November morning, delivered by special courier from Massachusetts. Theodore's associate, James Hartford, was known for unconventional solutions to family problems. The correspondence contained detailed accounts of how other elite families had resolved inheritance questions. "My dear Theodore," the letter read, "I know of your difficulties producing an heir. Allow me to share knowledge that may seem controversial, but has proven effective in our circles. Mr. Charles Pemberton, our neighbor, faced a similar situation. His wife, after years of unsuccessful attempts, provided him 3 healthy sons through an unconventional method." The letter proceeded to describe how certain families permitted specific factory workers, chosen for their health and physical vigor, to maintain relations with their wives, always under the husband's supervision and complete control. The children born from these unions were registered as legitimate, guaranteeing the continuity of the family line. Theodore read and reread the correspondence for weeks. The idea disturbed him profoundly, but also awakened desperate hope. His Presbyterian upbringing and the era's values made the proposal almost unthinkable. However, the prospect of dying without heirs tormented him more than any moral consideration. During December 1892, Theodore discreetly observed the factory owners who did business with his bank. He began noticing details that previously went unnoticed. Which ones were most successful? Which demonstrated greater intelligence? Which had physical characteristics that could enhance his lineage? The industrial age had created a mentality where workers were viewed as resources and instruments. For Theodore, the factory owners weren't equals. They were tools that could be utilized to solve his succession problem. Catherine noticed changes in her husband's behavior. He observed her more intensely, asked strange questions about her monthly cycle, and demonstrated renewed interest in matters related to procreation. When he finally decided to reveal the letter's contents, he chose an evening in January after dinner. "Catherine," he said, "we need to discuss our situation. I have a proposal that could give us the children we desperately want, but it requires your complete cooperation and discretion. Catherine's initial reaction was shock and revulsion. The idea of maintaining intimate relations with factory owners contradicted everything she had learned about morality and social position. She argued, wept, and begged her husband to reconsider. But Theodore had made his decision. He presented the proposal not as a request, but as a determination. In the patriarchal society of the era, women had little power to decide their own lives. A husband's authority was absolute, especially in matters considered familial. February 1893 marked the beginning of the most bizarre process in the Whitmore family history. Theodore established rigorous criteria for selecting the factory owners who would participate in his plan. It wouldn't be a random choice. Every detail was calculated to maximize success chances. The first criterion was physical health. Theodore arranged private medical examinations for 7 factory owners who regularly conducted business with his bank, under the pretense of insurance assessments. The second criterion was intelligence. Theodore observed which men demonstrated greater capacity for reasoning, refined business acumen, or knowledge about industrial operations. He believed these characteristics could be transmitted to future heirs. The third criterion, though never openly admitted, was physical appearance. Theodore wanted children born from the arrangement to have features that wouldn't immediately betray their mixed origins. He sought men with refined features that approximated Anglo-Saxon standards. After 3 weeks of observation, 7 factory owners were selected. James McCarthy, 29, owned a textile mill, was educated and demonstrated natural leadership in business circles. Robert Sullivan, 26, managed a steel foundry, had exceptional engineering skills for the era. William Peterson, 31, operated a lumber mill, was known for his physical strength and business knowledge. Henry Anderson, 27, owned a printing press, was literate and maintained detailed business records. Charles O'Brien, 25, managed agricultural distribution, had knowledge about commodity markets. Edward Jensen, 30, operated a machinery workshop, was respected among industrialists for his wisdom. Thomas Cooper, 28, owned a furniture factory, was a skilled craftsman responsible for supplying Chicago's elite. The selection wasn't immediately communicated to the chosen men. Theodore first needed to establish the arrangement's rules and prepare Catherine for what was coming. During February, he rented a small house in a discreet neighborhood, far from curious eyes. The location would be used for the encounters, guaranteeing privacy and complete control over the situation. Pause for a moment and reflect. We're talking about a banking magnate treating business associates as reproductive instruments. The industrial mentality transformed people into objects, denying them dignity or choice. If you're feeling disturbed by this story, leave your like. It's exactly this reflection we need to have about our past. On March 1, 1893, Theodore summoned the 7 factory owners to a private meeting at his banking house. It was a cold morning typical of Chicago's late winter, with snow covering the streets around LaSalle Street. The men gathered in Theodore's private office, standing, awaiting their banker's words. "Gentlemen, you've been chosen for a special arrangement," Theodore began, pacing slowly before the 7. "An arrangement that could bring benefits to all of us, but requires absolute discretion and cooperation." The silence was total. The factory owners maintained respectful postures, typical when in the presence of their primary creditor. None imagined what was coming. "My wife and I have faced difficulties having children," Theodore continued. "You will help resolve this situation. Each of you will have the opportunity to contribute so that Catherine may conceive." The revelation caused visible shock among the men. James McCarthy, the most experienced, dared to raise his eyes slightly, trying to comprehend if he had understood correctly. Robert Sullivan clenched his fists, controlling his surprise. The others remained motionless, processing the impossible information. Theodore proceeded to explain the arrangement's rules. Each factory owner would have a specific weekday designated for encounters with Catherine. The encounters would always occur in the rented house, always under his indirect supervision. Any attempt at contact outside the established schedule would result in the termination of all banking relationships and public exposure. The factory owners who participated would receive benefits, favorable loan terms, priority business considerations, and potential partnership opportunities. But it was also clear that refusal wasn't truly an option. In the industrial hierarchy, Theodore controlled the financial lifelines of their businesses. "If any of you successfully fathers a child with my wife," Theodore declared, "That man will receive a substantial investment in his business and preferential banking terms for life. The others will continue receiving the promised benefits." The promise of financial advantage was both motivation and control mechanism. Theodore knew it would create competition among the factory owners, decreasing chances of conspiracy or exposure. James McCarthy was assigned Mondays, Robert Tuesdays, William Wednesdays, Henry Thursdays, Charles Fridays, Edward Saturdays, and Thomas Sundays. The schedule would be followed rigorously during Catherine's fertile period each month. Catherine, who observed the scene from an adjacent office through a partially open door, felt a mixture of humiliation and terror. She had spent weeks trying to convince her husband to abandon the idea, but her pleas were ignored. In patriarchal society of the era, she had no choice but to submit to her husband's will. A physician was consulted about special treatments to increase Catherine's chances of conceiving. Dr. Harrison Mitchell, though surprised, didn't question Theodore's decisions. Medicine of the era frequently recommended unorthodox methods for fertility problems. The first week of the arrangement was scheduled to begin in April, coinciding with Catherine's fertile period. The factory owners were instructed about how to proceed, what to wear, and how to behave during encounters. Everything was planned to maintain the apparent dignity of the situation, even in such a degrading circumstance. Monday, April 3, 1893, dawned cold and gray. The typical Chicago spring chill covered the city with a melancholy blanket that seemed to reflect the tense environment dominating the Whitmore household. Catherine awoke knowing this would be the most difficult day of her life. James McCarthy had received detailed instructions the previous evening. He should arrive at the rented house at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Theodore would remain nearby, ensuring no one approached and that the encounter proceeded as planned. The small frame house had been furnished simply but properly. A bed with clean linens, a basin with scented water, and a single window offering a view of a small garden. The environment was prepared to maintain some appearance of civility in a completely dehumanizing situation.